All right. So if you've been following the channel, you know that recently I've been talking about abortion, and I've been taking the pro-life position mainly because I cannot really find a kind of consistent, metaphysically robust position on pro-choice. But today I want to actually explain one way, that's one kind of alternative way of looking at the whole issue that can open up the route to pro-choice. So I will explain what kind of view should we have, how it is different from other viewpoints and similar ones for pro-choice, and just talk about the pros and cons of this position. All right, so the position that I'm looking at first requires a kind of dualistic viewpoint on humans and persons. Now, I don't mean Cartesian dualism in a sense that we have two different substances. We have the material substance, and then we have the kind of mental immaterial substance, essentially immaterial substance. The view that I'm looking at is something known as non-Cartesian dualism, something that was put forward by E.J. Lowe, a metaphysician, and I'm kind of advocating for that position. Makes a lot of sense to me. And so in that kind of framework, it's possible to see a way to pro-choice, and I will explain how. All right, so what is non-Cartesian dualism? It basically means that we have, there is this body substance, which is essentially material. And then we have a kind of mental, psychological person who is not identical with the body. Nevertheless, it does have physical properties. So that's the difference with Cartesian. The Cartesian says that we don't have any physical properties, but in non-Cartesian, we say we actually do. So we are persons that have bodies, and in virtue of having those bodies, we gain some physical properties. So even though I'm not identical with my body, but I still do have a weight, I have a height, I have a position and extension in space. So that's the way of thinking about non-Cartesian dualism. But still, I am the person which is not identical with the body. And the relation is basically that I am a person who has a body. So I am not a human being. We are not human beings. We have human beings as our bodies. Human beings are these biological entities, and we are persons who have those human beings as bodies. Now, how does this help with the concept of abortion? Well, we do know that human beings are created at the moment of conception, but since persons are not identical with human beings, it is possible to say that persons are not there when human beings are created. So the main way of looking at the problem is that we have the moment of conception, we have this human being that is created, which will later on become our body. And somewhere along the road, I will talk about it more, a person is created. In the same sense that we have, for example, some clay, and you make a statue out of it. So when you have clay, there is no statue. You start to shape it. And after you shape it, you can, for example, shape it into the figure of Aristotle, and then you say, okay, now I have a statue of Aristotle. A statue of Aristotle comes into existence the moment that you make that a statue. There are also very good metaphysical discussions to defend the idea that the statue and the clay are not identical to each other because they have different persistent conditions. You can do something that will destroy the clay, but it will not destroy the statue. For example, you can take a piece of clay out, you can make a hole inside the statue. The statue remains the same, but the mass of clay that was there is different. So basically, they're not identical to each other. And in the same sense, we can have a human being, and that human being is shaped, and at a certain point in time, a person is created. which is not identical to the human body. So that's the general picture. Now, of course, this is different. I mean, we have to make sure to see the difference between this position and the other positions for pro-choice. So we hear, for example, people say, okay, we have a human being, and then we have this concept of personhood, and we only give moral value to a human being, for example, when it's conscious, or when it's self-conscious, or when it has like a brain activity, heartbeat, or whatever, right? Now, within this view, what we are saying is that human beings are basically worthless, or at least we're assuming in our society that they're worthless, and we are giving the worth to the person. So a human being, the body that we have, the animal that we have as a body, is never a person. It doesn't matter what kind of condition it has. On its own, it's never morally relevant to the story. It's the person that's relevant to the story. You see, so we're not saying that we have a human being that's worthless, that's like, for example, fetus, and then we have a human being that's worth something because he has consciousness or whatever. No, what we're saying is that we have a constant human being, which is worthless, and then on top of that, at a certain point of time, a person comes into existence, and that person, which is not identical to the body, that's something that we need to, at least we seem to give some kind of moral worth to it, just to remain consistent with other facts that we have, or other moral facts that we have. So that's one of the main differences between this viewpoint and the viewpoint that we have, for example, that, you look at something in the human body, and then you say, okay, now the human body is important. But I will explain later that there is some way to justify it, but we have to take this in mind. So the second difference is being a person is not a phase that we go through, because there's also this concept that we have some animals that go through different phases. And at one phase, they live in the water. At the second phase, they lose their tail. They have a completely different form, or they gain wings. And so they go through different phases, but they are the same identical animal. And in philosophy, we usually call those things phase sortals. So there are sorts of things that are related only to a phase of an animal life. So it might be suggested that we also go through different phase sortals. In one phase of our life, we are just a human being. In another phase of our life, we become a person. And then another phase, we might again become a human being. But that's not true based on this view, because we are not, if this view is correct, and we are never a fetus, because we don't exist there. The human being is there, and the human being is still here, but the person does not exist there. So we cannot say that we passed through the fetus phase, or the phase of being human, and now we are in the phase of being a person. No, we're talking about two different entities here. So that's the general viewpoint, right? So if that point of time at which persons come into existence is late enough, then we can justify abortion, because that's killing a human being, and human beings are not considered morally in our discussion. It's only the persons that are important. Now this view of personhood is robust in a sense that, since it really it's not related to the body as such, the persistent condition of persons can be quite different from conditions of the body. So in the same sense that when you have a statue, you can actually destroy the clay without destroying the statue. You can just remove the whole clay and replace it with another material, and then you still have the same statue, we can say. Here, the body is not really important. So even if you remove, for example, the consciousness out of the body, even if you remove most of the things out of the body that, for example, we would get in the course of sleep, or in course of coma, we can still have the person. See, so that's the difference. So if we tie personhood, for example, to consciousness, then this question arises, okay, what about when we go to sleep? But here we're talking about two different entities, and the persistent condition of these two entities are different. So now it makes sense to talk about a person whose body is sleeping, a person whose body is in a coma. The person is still there, but the body is in the coma. This also creates this kind of metaphysical possibility. It's not related to this discussion, but it's also possible for the person to survive even brain death, for example. Even much more destruction to the body that we can imagine. Even total death of the body. Metaphysically, it seems possible. But as I said, that's not related to these issues. Maybe on the organ donation topics that one might discuss there. So that's a good thing about this approach, that it's robust in the sense of like metaphysical issues. It answers those kind of sleep, coma. It's also good because it answers the argument from Alexander Proust that I was once a fetus, by saying that actually no, we were never a fetus, because the argument of Alexander Proust is that, okay, if the fetus is not me, then what happens to the fetus? So we have a fetus up to a certain point, call him like Bill or Bob, and then I come into existence. What happens to Bob? If Bob is not me, then Bob dies and I come into existence at a certain point of time. But that doesn't seem to happen. And that's correct, that doesn't happen, because if we're calling the fetus Bob, the Bob is still here. So I was not there as a fetus. But this body, the human being that I have as a body, did exist back then. So Bob still exists, Bob is still here, and I have Bob as my body. A human being comes into existence at the moment of conception, and it stays there until it dies. And on top of it, at a certain point of time, a human person comes into existence in the same sense that we say that you have a piece of clay, you shape it into a statue. The statue is there, and then you destroy the piece of clay, for example, you can still have the statue remaining there. So there's two different layers, different persistent conditions. So it's an interesting alternative to pro-choice positions. I can understand on this view how one person might be pro-choice. But of course, there are some costs to pay. First, you have to have this kind of dualistic viewpoint, which is not that difficult for me because I like this dualistic, non-Cartesian dualism. So I can subscribe to that. But of course, the main issue is when that person comes into existence. That's a difficult question. But the difficulty is not about, okay, when the brain starts or when the consciousness starts, like these kind of empirical data. The question is more like when you're forming the clay into a statue, when exactly the statue come into existence. Because at one point of time, if you have just a piece of clay, everyone can agree that there is no statue there. Once you have the statue, everyone can agree that there is a statue there. Now the change is gradual. So at one point in time, the statue comes into existence. But when? That depends, So the analogy is that when we have, at the moment of conception, a human being comes into existence, that's like raw clay. And that clay is being formed by its own process. So it's like a self-forming clay. And it gets changed until it has this form of statue, and that's the statue is born. That's when the human person comes into existence. So it might also be the case that we don't know exactly how persons are created. So it might be even that the person is not even created after the human body, the human is born. So it might be that we have a human, the human is conscious, you have a 2-year-old, but they're still not a person. So that becomes important, exactly what we mean by a person, right? That would become the critical question. And for now, we can define a person as an entity that has this kind of self-referential mental activity that you can say I am doing something, I am talking, this kind of self-awareness. But exactly how to detect that is a different problem. One might say, okay, we can look at the brain and based on that realize exactly when we have a person. That's the viewpoint that we said, okay, that we said a difference, but I said also that it's kind of close to it, that we look at the brain activity and then we say, okay, it seems now we cannot kill this human being because now it's worth something. Here on this idea is, it would be like this, that we look at the body and then we say, okay, that kind of activity can only comes if there is a person whose body we are investigating here. So for example, if I'm thinking about something, if I'm feeling something, if I'm willing something, I'm wanting to do something, there will be some changes in my body, right? On this dualistic viewpoint, the human being that I have as my body, it cannot will, it cannot feel, it's not conscious, it's not self-conscious the way that I am. Thoughts and everything, all the mental activities that I'm doing, that's not the body, that's me, the person who's doing it. But I'm using the body that I have to do all of these things. So there are certain reflections is in my body. So when I'm thinking about something, you can see some pattern in my thought. When I want to, for example, change my body so I can speak, you will see some changes in my voice. You can see something happening in my brain. So there are some physical manifestations of those mental activities that the person is doing. So the idea is that if we see similar activities in another human being, another, biological entity, then we can assume that there is a person who's using that body as a body. But the argument is not clear to me exactly how can we infer just because they're similar. That doesn't mean, I would say, that there's exactly a body, that is a person over there. But still, so that's a question. When exactly that happens, it might be that it's much later than even the pro-choice wants it to be. It might be that the personhood starts like 1, 2, 3, 5-year-old. When you are in that age, you start to have this kind of, you start to have thoughts. You start to think about yourself as like an I. Like I feel something, I want to do something. This kind of personality, I would say. So it might be that, how to detect it. There's also this other issue that this kind of formation of human beings into these bodies that can embody persons. It might not be during the process of like pregnancy. It's not necessarily during pregnancy. It might be that if we go back in time, for example, if we go 40, 50,000 years back, the formation that we're talking about happened actually back then. And after a certain time, we start to have human beings that are persons. And from that moment forward, every human being that's born is actually born with a person. So they both come into existence at the same time, because again, this we really don't know what the person, this mental thing that we're talking about is not completely clear for us. So we really don't know how it works, how it persists. We know how human beings reproduce and how that reproduction and the personhood works. Like, is it if we have two persons, they have two bodies, they reproduce, does that mean that the baby immediately has a person also with it? That's a difficult problem to answer. But yeah, I mean, in the pros are pretty strong to consider this option, and I believe this viewpoint can be robust enough. For example, for someone like me, who was very critical of these details, is robust enough for me to accept, for example, a pro-choice position. I'm not pro-choice yet. I wouldn't say that that this is strong enough for me, but I'm just saying that this is a possible route to have a kind of consistent, metaphysically robust way of thinking about pro-choice position.